Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's program, The Future of U.S.-China Tech Competition. I'd like to welcome all of you, and I'm so glad to see that we have a wide-ranging and diverse audience from people around the world. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Susan Elliott, President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and we're really pleased to host today's discussion. I'd like to welcome all of you and thank you for taking the time to participate in this really important program on U.S.-China tech competition. We are excited and look forward to examining this complex issue and the role it plays in relations between the world's two biggest economies, the United States and China. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome and special thanks to our panelists who are participating. We have assembled a really esteemed and expert group of experts, and we hope that you will enjoy the discussion that we have today. So before I briefly introduce everyone and then turn the discussion over to Susan Thornton, who's the project director for the NCAFP's Forum on Asia Pacific Security, I would just say that, today's conversation is being recorded. For people who haven't been able to participate or listen in, we will post the recording on our website soon after the program is over. We also invite members of the audience to ask questions. If you look at the bottom of your screen, we would ask that you put your questions in the Q&A box, and the NCAFP staff and I will help Susan and the panelists to answer as many questions as time allows. So we're really looking forward to a great, robust discussion. And so now I'd like to introduce the panelists to you. First of all, we have Samm Sacks, who's a senior fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center and cyber policy fellow at New America. Next, we have Kendra Schaefer, who is head of tech policy research at Trivium, China. And finally, we have Paul Triolo, who is the Senior Vice President for China and Technology Policy Lead at Denton's Global Advisors. So we're hopeful that today's discussion will lead for increased opportunities to engage and better understand the priorities of the U.S. and the difference between the U.S. and China tech policy, and to hopefully build on areas of mutual interest for the future. So now with that, I'd like to turn the program over to Susan Thornton, who is the director of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy's Forum on Asia Pacific Security. She'll moderate today's discussion. And again, thanks to everyone for participating today. So Susan, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Susan, very much for the introduction and for framing this very important conversation. I've been so excited to have this conversation with this really esteemed group of panelists. I was so excited that I had my own technology competition with myself to get in here today. So sorry for being a couple minutes late, but it's really great to see Paul, Sam, and Kendra here, and it's going to be a terrific conversation. I mean, this is a topic that is so much in the news. Every single day you can find a headline about the US-China technology competition. There's a lot of competing strands of thought, of topics, and competing legislation, and a lot of rhetoric around the topic. So I think it's really essential and helpful, and I really thank the panelists for being with us today to try to shed some light and some clarity on the topic of US-China technology competition. And we couldn't have three better experts to try to unpack all of this for us. So I think what I'll do is of course, we'll have a conversation, and I invite the panelists to jump in at any point that you want to. I'll definitely recognize raised hands, but please don't feel that you have to jump in if you have a two-finger, and then we'll go to questions at the end of the program. So maybe, Paul, if I could just, start with you, because really the headline on this issue recently, and a lot of new book titles and everything, are alarmingly, in my view, focused on the coming conflict between the US and China over Taiwan. And Taiwan, of course, has always been a flashpoint in US-China relations, but only recently has the issue of Taiwan's monopoly on advanced semiconductor manufacturing come into this conversation. And you've written that the intensifying US-China tech competition is likely to have profound regional security implications, especially for potential military conflict between the US and China over Taiwan, but also more generally for the broader Asia Pacific. So can you just talk maybe a bit at the beginning here about the issue of US-China tech competition and how it has become now an issue over which people are talking about US-China military conflict, and how should we think about this?
Yes, thanks, Susan. And yeah, very complicated question. Lot to unpack there. I think I would note that today, one of the first news stories that I saw in my Twitter feed was about the US wargaming the issue of Taiwan, and including the issue of TSMC, which of course is the leading Taiwan company in the semiconductor arena, which accounts for something like 90%, depending on who you talk to, of advanced semiconductors, and a good chunk of the world's foundry capacity, which is the ability to manufacture semiconductors for using other companies' designs. So the TSMC and Taiwan issue has become a really key part now of thinking, both in Beijing, arguably, and in Washington around the Taiwan problem, if you will. And part of that is related to this technology competition issue, and TSMC's sort of unique role, and Taiwan's unique role in the ICT sector, the sort of information technology sector, where TSMC provides services to many companies around the world, and is a huge player in that sector. And that sort of realization, I think, has dawned on policymakers in Washington over the last 2 or 3 years. It's the reason, for example, for the CHIPS Act, which passed recently, which is an attempt the U.S. to onshore some of that advanced manufacturing so that we're not so dependent on Taiwan. And then if you look at, so industrial policy has focused more and more on the semiconductor industry, and again, Taiwan's role in it. And then on the sort of control side, the US government's restrictions on Chinese companies have drawn in Taiwan into the equation. So it's almost as though the US is attempting to force Taiwan to choose between the so-called blue supply chain and the red supply chain. And that's sort of, I think, the crux of the issue. And then, of course, in a context that you're very familiar with, where US-China relations, for example, are in such a bad state, this sort of adds to the mix of issues we see here. And so we had during the recent Pelosi visit, for example, to Taiwan, which of course generated the so-called fourth Taiwan Strait crisis. The issue came up again because, for example, any kind of an air blockade around Taiwan would immediately impact the semiconductor industry in Taiwan, which is reliant heavily on global inputs from a variety of places for all sorts of upstream products and shipping out semiconductors via air. And so there was a lot of speculation, of course, in the media and other places about the issue again of the centrality of Taiwan and TSMC to the global economy. So I think we're sort of in this situation now where any kind of issue around Taiwan has to sort of bring in the technology piece and the technology competition between the US and China.
Yeah, and I guess maybe for our audience that might not know, I mean, Taiwan has become this semiconductor manufacturing dynamo, you know, as it's worked over the last several decades, right, to really hone its skills in this area. And as the semiconductor industry has become kind of more specialized, right? And so we don't really have this capability in the US right now. And actually, the place that manufactures the most advanced semiconductors, which are needed for, I guess, the most advanced kind of uses, including things like cell phones, computers, and AI, artificial intelligence computing, quantum computing, and other things, can only at this point be had, you know, from TSMC. Can you just mention a little bit about maybe like how that happened and what the US government's trying to do to diversify or try to get back some of this
Sure.
um,
Sure.
capacity and whether that's possible?
Right. That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, TSMC briefly, I mean, the business model that was pioneered by Morris Chang at TSMC was to focus on the manufacturing side of semiconductors, and to allow companies to provide their designs to TSMC, and TSMC would just focus on manufacturing. So as the technology matured and became more complex, and the costs, for example, of doing manufacturing became really high, this model ended up being being sort of the winner, as opposed to things like integrated device manufacturers like Intel, which manufacture that design and manufacture their own chips. Now that model is still operative, of course, globally, but as you note, the sort of specialization of chips, the design of chips optimized, for example, for AI workloads and high performance computing, and other applications, that the boom in that arena was only possible really because of companies like TSMC, and to some degree Samsung also, in South Korea, which also is a big player in the foundry business. And those companies, again, specialized in manufacturing and the R&D related to manufacturing, and sort of took the burden off the other companies to do all that, because it became prohibitively cost prohibitive for companies to do sort of the full cycle of design and manufacturing. And so that model has won out. Now, the problem is that TSMC proved to be better than other companies at that. And so over time, as the technology has advanced, they've been able to really push the envelope in terms of advanced manufacturing, so that we wake up in, say, 2019 with TSMC having around 90% of those most advanced chips, which, as you correctly note, are used in a variety of consumer applications. They're also used in military applications, let's be frank here, right? And so the idea that 90% of that capacity is in Taiwan, in a very fragile geopolitical region, is something that forced the U.S. government to some degree to respond to this. And that's at least the main driver, I think, of the CHIPS Act, which was the idea that, hey, the U.S. needs to have some of that capacity to design and build advanced semiconductors in the U.S. Now, that's the problem with that, is it's happening at a time, of course, when the costs to build these are very high. So government subsidies are really going to be needed for this. And so over the next 5 to 10 years, the U.S. is going to have advanced manufacturing in the U.S. by TMC, by Samsung, and by Intel, which are all competing, if you will, at the cutting edge. But that's going to take time. And there's still a big question about whether the U.S. is committed to industrial policy like this. This is sort of new to, a new scale here, and whether there's enough STEM students and graduates and engineers to do this. And Taiwan officials, for example, have expressed a lot of doubt about this, about whether the U.S. is really committed to what it will take to develop an advanced manufacturing ecosystem, and sustain it over the long term. So I think we're at the beginning. The CHIPS Act is sort of a down payment on that. And already, of course, companies like TSMC are building new facilities in the U.S., but it's still it's a 5 to 10 year process to see how this plays out, whether commercially this makes sense for all parties involved, and whether the U.S. government will be able to do things like immigration reform and workforce training to really make this happen, to develop the ecosystem you need to sustain advanced semiconductor manufacturing.
Okay, great. I mean, this is this is a really complicated conversation. I was going to go to talk about data next, but maybe Kendra, we can come next to you, because Paul's really outlined kind of the conundrum with respect to one particular angle on the US tech competition, which is the semiconductor manufacturing, which seems to be a very big issue in terms of this competition, in terms of a lot of the policies that have been rolled out by the Biden administration to try to curb and maybe previously too by other administrations prior to the Biden administration, to try to curb the prospect that China would be able to get this technology, and in that way try to sort of control the aperture on China's technology advancement. But now, I guess, as Paul has outlined it, it seems like we are trying to get Taiwan maybe to choose, which means that China is going to be clearly, from their vantage, in some trouble here with respect to their ability to obtain these semiconductor chips, which are also, I take it, essential for their development and a lot of their consumer applications and defense applications. And they've been getting these chips, I gather, from Taiwan in the same way that we have. Everyone's been outsourcing and ordering from Taiwan.
Yeah.
If they can't do that anymore, I mean, you've been in China for so many years, you have a really unique vantage to bring to this conversation on sort of the Chinese view of things, what kind of policies they've pursued on their part at first, maybe to try to, get this advanced semiconductor manufacturing capability. And then as they've faced these headwinds, how have they reacted? So just sort of from the Chinese standpoint and their policies, how do you see this whole semiconductor issue?
Yeah, well, the question, well, first of all, let me say thanks for having me. My internet connection is not the best, so if I have to turn off my video, let me know.
Sam, I can come to you for the questions related to, anything you want to comment on that's been said so far, but also, the other aspect that we frequently talk about with respect to US-China tech competition is, data flows. And we hear a lot about data being the new oil, the dangers of China getting or having more of our data or getting our data at all. And I wonder if you could talk a bit while we're trying to get Kendra back online here about what are the dangers surrounding data as we've been thinking about them in the US government and elsewhere, and then sort of what should be done and what is being done if those aren't the same thing. And then maybe if you can talk a bit about the difference between like privacy concerns and security concerns. I mean, how should we think about the security concerns versus the privacy concerns when it comes to sort of these data questions?
Susan, thanks for the question. And I think in this panel, it's great that we're treating the topic of technology not as monolithic. So there's a tremendous focus specifically on semiconductor supply chains. And I always defer to Paul and to Kendra, who just wrote a great piece that I highly recommend. Maybe someone can put it in the chat, specifically on the export control package that's due to drop, I think, if it hasn't already, while we're on this call. But tech is not monolithic. And so this conflict over technology is indeed playing out across a number of different fronts. And the area that I've been speaking most recently to the Senate about just 2 weeks ago, there was a hearing on the question of foreign adversary access to data is very much top of mind for US policymakers. Here, I think what I in my recommendations, when I have these conversations, I say, look, we need to talk about what part of this challenge when it comes to data is specific to China. And I can give an answer about where I think there are risks related to China. But so much of this is bigger than China and has to do with questions of what is the US vision? What is an affirmative US vision for how we govern the internet, for digital technologies, for cross-border data flows? And I think it's important to distinguish that. Because the rules of the road have not been set. And I think what's happened is, in many ways, from Washington, I see us legislating privacy and also data security through the lens of the China threat alone. And if we just look at, which is not going to make us necessarily more safe or secure or prosperous, right? So let's just talk about the topic that's always in the headlines these days, which is TikTok. Let's assume that TikTok is going to go through its CFIUS mitigation plan. Oracle is going to become the data controller. The vast majority of that data will be stored on servers in the US. There will be audits on what third parties and outside the US have access to that data. TikTok will have the most secure data of any platform operating in the United States, with more oversight than anyone else, while Facebook will be able to still openly buy and sell that data to whoever it wants in the world, including security services in Beijing or whatnot. And the reason is because we don't have a broader, comprehensive approach to dealing with these issues. So we're playing whack-a-mole based on country of origin, which is not making our data more secure. But I think what it is doing is contributing to this broader environment where governments around the world, not just China and the US, But across Europe and India and Vietnam and the like are beginning to create walls around data and treating data as a national asset to be hoarded, to be weaponized. So that's the big picture. How do we, let's focus on better securing the data, regardless of who it's going to, of who's handling it. That's the first step. Now, what is the China-specific risk? There are some, honestly. I don't think this is just a China issue, but all manner of governments around the world conduct espionage using openly available, publicly scraped data that's available online. I think that this is a risk that would be particularly concerning if you have a national security clearance, if you have access to critical information infrastructure and your data is out there. Could this be used by a security service in China to conduct coercion or blackmail in order to gain access to sensitive US classified information? Potentially. Are there also issues around bulk electronic surveillance? For the first time, the United States has a peer competitor when it comes to global surveillance. And I think we are worried about what Chinese firms controlling the ICT infrastructure and data flows beyond their borders could do as far as gathering those for all manner of intelligence gathering purposes. We know it well because of the Snowden revelations, and now I think we have a peer competitor that would be in a position to do that as well. So are these real national security issues? Yes, and then the question is, how do we deal with them in a way that's going to get at the root cause of those vulnerabilities?
So just to poke at that a little bit before we come back to Kendra, because she's back online now without her video on. So I do want to come to you, Kendra, in just a minute. But so, clearly the reason that a lot of this is being viewed through a China prism is that China's capabilities are kind of manifoldly different from pretty much any other peer competitor in the world, right? So they have unique capabilities compared to others we might be worried about. And there is this, state involvement in all of this that makes the line between, a private company and the national security impetus of the state in China very blurred. So, I guess, the concerns that have been raised, for example, about TikTok have mostly to do with the notion that the Chinese state might use the TikTok algorithm to somehow, manipulate the algorithm such that it would be able to make Americans, young people, kind of less patriotic or something. It's sort of similar to the kinds of things that we heard around the 2020 election, the 2016 election, about what Russia was trying to do via social media accounts, in a kind of using artificial accounts and bots and other things to sort of make America more. So it's kind of like a psychological warfare operation. And so I think, the questions have always been about like TikTok's employees in Beijing, or, what control the Chinese state might have eventually at some point over the algorithm or other things. So I guess, how would you think about those kinds of issues that do actually kind of make China different from everybody else?
Yeah, and Susan, I'm glad that you raised that, because I do think that it's important to just distinguish two national security potential risks when we're talking about TikTok. One is the data access one, which I mentioned before, but the other one is this question of what information is the algorithm favoring, pushing in front of users, which is increasingly a medium that people of all generations, not just young people, but I think more generations are using it to consume information, right? This is one that I frankly am somewhat more worried about. I think that this is one which is a concern, because, that we know that the dangers that misinformation can pose, and what would it mean to have that information coming from the Communist Party of China's leadership. I will say, though, again, this is a bigger problem than China. Just look at the fact that January 6th was organized on Facebook and Twitter. When we look at the way that misinformation, disinformation has severely threatened the democratic information process in our own country, we need to look no further than misinformation about the pandemic, about election fraud. So is there a risk that the Chinese Communist Party could somehow create information that would be pushed in front of an American audience that would say democracy and capitalism is not the way to go, and this would be done so subtly and so targeted that it would be convincing and make its way into the public narrative? Potentially. The more near-term threats that I worry about are the way that other platforms, regardless of where they're coming from, are pushing out information around the future of democracy and public health in our own country. So again, let's take a step back and look at this beyond the silo of the zero-sum US versus China and figure out, how do we grapple with these huge questions about how we will run and govern our digital economy and what that means for people consuming information at this really crucial moment in our own country.
Great. No, thank you very much, Sam. And I actually, very, very relatable as we all sort of sit in front of our screens and have information pushed at us that we don't want or think is not sort of what we would like to be exposed to. So I think we'll come back to that, but I want to go to Kendra now, who unfortunately was cut off in the middle of a blockbuster sentence. So Kendra, we kind of missed the money line there. So if you wouldn't mind just sort of retaking up this issue about sort of how the Chinese are viewing, you know, the tech policy competition and how they're seeing it and how they're responding.
Sure. Let's see if we can get a better audio signal this time. So, you know, obviously the tech policy competition is a huge issue. You know, how China views competition with the US on digital infrastructure like 5G is one issue. How they view competition on cross-border data, as Sam just addressed, is another issue. But specifically in terms of sanctions in the semiconductor space, just to come back to that for a second, I think I got cut off when I was saying I think we see sanctions as a better alternative to war, right? This kind of path to affecting desired outcomes. It avoids violence. But historically speaking, that's not necessarily the case, right? There have been plenty of incidents historically, incidents that very much resemble the current time, where sanctions escalate conflict or result in increased aggression by the sanctioned party. And that's particularly true in cases where the country being sanctioned was a powerful country on the rise, as China is, where that rise was a matter of national pride, as it is to China today, and where sanctions cut that country off from a vital resource or commodity which enables that rise, as we are starting to cut China off from access to semiconductors, right? Another historical example is the oil embargo leveraged on Japan in the 1940s, right, contributed to Japan's decision to bomb Pearl Harbor. No, none of that is to say, of course, modern China is not militarist Japan. But if we corner China on semiconductors, as Paul was kind of alluding to there, I cannot imagine a future in which Beijing rolls over. Everything we've heard has essentially said, and I don't really think the US government has processed this, that the 2018 sanctions against Huawei and ZTE were a watershed moment for the China side, right? They realized how vulnerable they were, and it really pushed them into a whole new track of hardware competition, right? And partially that's because, again, we keep implementing sanctions for the purpose, ostensibly, of preventing China from using advanced technologies in military applications. But that's not all we're preventing China from doing, right? China has put all of its eggs in the technology basket. The plan is to use technological development as the primary vector for modernization and advancement, not just military advancement, but moving people out of poverty, protecting food security, solving climate issues, right? Moving the manufacturing sector up the value chain, right? They need chips for all those goals. So take away China's ability to do that stuff, and a cornered country is dangerous and unpredictable. And that makes a more dangerous and unpredictable world. So frankly, I worry that we will end up pushing too hard by playing an ill-considered game without a de-escalation plan. And frankly, it wouldn't be, I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, it wouldn't be the first time we've done that. You know, and we're also not really providing a very clear path to get those sanctions lifted, right? Sanctions are more effective in driving discrete behavior change when you've got a carrot at the end of the stick. Do this and we'll remove the sanctions. But, you know, increasingly we're ratcheting up the pressure and not really providing a clear path for de-escalation. You know, we just told NVIDIA, et cetera, that they can't export, you know, as Paul mentioned, advanced GPUs. I don't see a path out. There's no path out of that, right? There's no path out of that. That just creates pain and doesn't, you know, doesn't provide a path forward. Anyway,
what is the behavior change that you think that we're looking for in response to these sanctions?
I can tackle one of you.
Either one, anyone that wants to take that on.
Oh, Paul, you want that one? Go ahead.
Yeah, look, I think that we have to step back a little bit and say, okay, why are we having these this significant uptick in some of these controls? I just finished reading the preamble to the new U.S. Commerce Department controls that just dropped about 2 minutes ago, and we can dive into that. But I think, as Kendra noted, you know, this is part of a process where the U.S. government has been, you know, arguably weaponizing the dominance of U.S. companies in both semiconductor production and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And this is being driven by a number of factors. If you step back and think about Secretary Blinken's speech in May, he put the technology competition at the center of U.S.-China relations, right? And so it includes all these things, including things that Sam mentioned around data and then artificial intelligence, and you know, there's the memes out there that we're in this titanic struggle with China over these technologies as a feature. So that's sort of the big picture. Specifically, though, on semiconductors have become sort of the poster boy here of the competition, because of the ability of the U.S. government to, for example, cut off supplies of certain semiconductors to Huawei, which has basically undermined that company's business model over the last 2 years, and also cutting off the flow of U.S. technology to Chinese artificial intelligence companies and others that were deemed to be threats to U.S. national security. So today we have sort of a really watershed a moment where new controls by the Biden administration are building on sort of Trump era controls that were put in place, and trying to plug the holes there, basically to give the U.S. government veto power over certain aspects of China's development of semiconductors and deployment of semiconductors, importantly, as Kendra noted. And so the new controls today, which were released in a document that's titled, and this is, you know, again, important to sort of understand the drivers here, is titled Implementation of Additional Export Controls, Certain Advanced Computing and Semiconductor Manufacturing Items, Supercomputer and Semiconductor End Use, and Entity List Modifications. So basically, in this case, the U.S. government is putting new controls on semiconductor manufacturing equipment, drawing specific lines around the types of and capabilities of equipment that can be shipped to Chinese end users, and putting new controls on things like graphical processing units, GPUs, which are used in these in the supercomputers and high performance computers that are mentioned in this new document. So the concern here is really, again, sort of military end use, in the sense of the potential for these computers and computer systems based on these semiconductors to be used to model weapon systems. If you remember last year, we had this hypersonic glide vehicle sort of a story that broke in September that China had tested this hypersonic glide vehicle. It turned out that weapon system had been designed on using CPUs designed in China but built in Taiwan at TSMC. So again, TSMC and Taiwan are sort of at the center of this, because a lot of the semiconductors, whether they're U.S. semiconductors being sold to China or Chinese companies designing semiconductors that end up getting used in some of these systems, are all made in Taiwan. So
yeah, so one just clarification, I
Mhm.
think, for the audience. So the restrictions, both those that exist currently and those that are being rolled out today by the Commerce Department, will not only prevent US-based companies from selling semiconductor manufacturing equipment or semiconductors themselves to China, but will also, is it true, extend to other countries who are involved in the semiconductor manufacturing process, of which there are many. I mean, the US is not
right.
capable of producing the whole end-to-end supply chain of semiconductors. So this will implicate, so will it mean that
Yes.
Taiwan can no longer sell things to China?
Well, again, it's a complicated mix of measures, but basically the extraterritorial use of export controls that began with Huawei, with the so-called foreign direct product rule, which did prevent foreign companies like TSMC and Samsung and others from supplying chips to Huawei. Yes, the new rules name 28 new Chinese companies that are already on the entity list, but had not had that rule applied to them before. And so that means that in this sector that they're trying to target with these new rules, high performance computing and AI related research centers, those centers now will not be able to obtain semiconductors from anywhere in the world, right? If they were obtaining semiconductors from Europe or from Japan, for example, those new entities under these new rules will not be able to obtain those semiconductors. But the U.S. the bottom line is for many of these things, the U.S. and U.S. companies are really the major players in this. So NVIDIA, for example, is providing its most advanced systems, the A100 series of semiconductors, for example, to many research centers in China that are doing AI research or doing high performance computing. So as Kendra notes, the impact of this is potentially much wider than just military applications. If indeed the U.S. government decides to not license, for example, U.S. companies like NVIDIA and AMD to provide those systems to entities in China that are not necessarily part of the military end use concern. So this new effort is a real ratcheting up of pressure on the whole Chinese ecosystem that uses these semiconductors, but it's not clear yet sort of how the U.S. government will implement this. Basically, the new rules will give the U.S. government the ability to target any company in China that uses these semiconductors and deny them access to those if it's determined that there's a national security issue there. So it sort of plugs some gaps in the U.S. export control system and gives the U.S. sort of more fine-grained control over both end use and also this manufacturing side of things, where the concern is that China is moving up the value chain in terms of manufacturing semiconductors.
Okay, so I'm glad you mentioned where Chinese manufacturing is at, because I want to come back to you, Kendra, to, one of the things that prompted a lot of the concern about China's technology advancements and its push was this Made in China 2025 plan that came to the attention, I guess, of the U.S. in sometime in the late 2010s and was taken up very, in a high profile way by the Trump administration and, was sort of, seemed to want to drive Chinese industry in a direction so as to take over kind of all of the advanced technology sectors that the US and other developed countries were working on and were leading in. And that really alarmed a lot of people. I want to go back because we've heard a lot about all the money China's pouring into the semiconductor sector. And maybe, you all can give us a sense of, how, so China's dependent on outside manufacturing for the most advanced chips, but where is it in its ability to manufacture chips to sustain itself, and how should we think about the road ahead on China's sort of self-sufficient manufacturing of these things it's being cut off from?
So are we talking about China's advanced manufacturing sector moving up the value chain, or China's ability to manufacture advanced chip technologies?
I think either one of those at this point, but I was more thinking about like all the money it's pouring into semiconductor manufacturing, basically after it's been confronted now with the Huawei blockages, et cetera.
Right. So the intensity of state funding around domestic semiconductor manufacturing has ratcheted up over the last few years. But the bottom line is that China is a decade or more behind other manufacturers, for example, Taiwan, the most advanced manufacturing on semiconductors, no matter how you cut it. And it is not just behind on one element, right? It is behind on the ability to, of course, manufacture the most advanced chips. Usually the most advanced chips are the smallest ones. I think the very cutting edge of chip design now is around 2 to 3 nanometers. Only one foundry in the world can really make those. China has been kind of hovering and stuck at around 14 to 7 nanometers, depending on who you ask. So pretty big differential between China and the most advanced chips. Plus, they're not graduating the amount of talent that they need. I think Chinese estimates put the talent differential at something like, they need 700,000 employees in the chip space. They're graduating 30,000 related, technical talents per year. I mean, that's a 10, 20-year gap just in the people. So on almost every single vector of chip development, China's behind. And so while they're pouring, and this is one of those sectors where just throwing money at it doesn't fix it. You cannot jump, you can maybe jump a couple of years, but you cannot jump the timeline, right? You cannot just throw money at it and get results next year or the year after the year after. So providing, the US is correct from a purely strategic perspective, right? Setting aside whether, the idea of whether or not I think all the pressure is a good idea or we're going down the right road, the US is absolutely correct in that semiconductors are the biggest choke point for China. And while they're throwing all of the policy solutions at it, best case scenario, they're 5 to 10 years out. I'd say 5 is very optimistic. I'd say they're 10 years out. Does that answer that question?
Terrific. Yes, thank you. I do want to come back, Sam, to you because, one of the things we constantly hear about is China's malign influence campaigns. And we talked a little bit about this with TikTok, but I'd really love to hear, and maybe whoever else wants to chime in on this topic. I mean, we hear from time to time about Chinese campaigns to influence our elections, or the Chinese export of its surveillance state capability to other countries. And I don't want to miss this chance to kind of address some of those broader concerns. And, if you could give us a kind of a reality check on, we've been talking about the semiconductor problem, which seems to be an issue of the US trying to make sure it keeps its leading edge in a very foundational technology. We've been talking about the data flows, which seems to be something about maybe privacy, maybe national security, maybe both. But then there's this issue about kind of using influence through the internet, in other ways. And I would love to get, because it's very kind of nebulous, I think, in terms of the cases that have been raised and the way it's portrayed. If you could give us some sort of more kind of tactile sense of what's really going on there, what should we be worried about, what should we be looking for, and is anything being done about this, or is it just a lot of worrying but without a lot that we can do about it?
Again, I'm going to come back to this point that part of this challenge is specific to China and part of it is much bigger than China. And it's just important to be clear-eyed about that. Does the Chinese government use one of the most sophisticated online monitoring and filtering systems in the world to create a closed internet and closely track and target people who have dissent online? Absolutely. And that's a whole topic of conversation and field of study. The next question is, what does that mean for information flows outside of China's borders? We know that the Chinese government has targeted dissidents and others abroad, and particularly tried to control the narrative around issues like Hong Kong, Uyghurs, Taiwan, South China Sea. For the most part, what I and other analysts have observed is that these information operations are primarily focused on China's domestic security issues. That's not to say that they're not going to expand, and perhaps they already have. I think there is less clear evidence, for example, of specific meddling in broader topics beyond China's domestic issues. Recently, there was an article, I believe it was the New York Times, where Facebook, Meta, reported on attempts by China to related to election misinformation in the run-up to the midterms. I think this is interesting in part because it came from Meta, and we've definitely seen, as I said before, Meta has been a clear beneficiary of the China tech Cold War at a moment when they are not regulated in this space. And they have benefited, I think, from playing up the China threat. Again, is the China threat real? Sure, we know about misinformation outside of China. I would say that those are primarily focused on domestic issues. When it comes to issues like election fraud, misinformation online, I think that our real adversaries in that space are at home and are probably not coming from China, although they could be coming from Russia and other foreign adversaries. But we have to be very clear about what is the origin of those campaigns. What are the motivations? If these are coming from China, what are the motivations? What are the end goals? Because right now, misinformation online is tearing apart the fabric of American democracy. And I think the threat is not coming from China.
Can I actually write in on the coattails, on Sam's coattails there for a second? I think Sam is totally right. I absolutely agree with her. And it also, we've got this conflict with China. When we talk about US-China competition in the digital space or the information space, we talk about misinformation, we talk about censorship. Those are usually the only two things that we that we really focus on. But it actually often surprises me that the US and China struggle to find things in common on tech and data regulation more broadly, because in so many respects, both countries are struggling to solve many of exactly the same problems and answer exactly the same questions, right? Problems like, how do we protect the data of our citizens from marketers, hackers, and hostile foreign powers? How do we prevent tech companies from becoming monopolies? How do we ensure that our social networks and the algorithms they build don't contribute to the erosion of trust in science or trust in each other, God forbid, right? And in the last couple of years, China has taken huge policy steps domestically, and if you don't mind me saying so, probably larger policy steps than the US has taken to answer some of those questions, to take a stab at solidifying the data privacy rules. They've gone after the way that tech companies use algorithms. They've gone after the way that tech companies are monopolizing their sectors. And so we actually, every time I read something that comes out of the White House on what the Biden administration is concerned about in tech domestically, I think that's weird. Chinese internet regulators could have written exactly word for word the same thing. So I think there's these points of contention. And then I actually think we have a lot more in common than we actually realize there.
So Kendra, let me follow up with you on that, because you were until recently in China, and there's been a lot of talk about China's zero COVID measures and the contributions that sort of China's digital surveillance have made to sort of making people in China feel, very unhappy about the current state of affairs. I mean, I, like you, see these Chinese regulations coming out. I mean, of course, the Chinese state is a lot more paternalistic. I mean, I think we're at 180 degrees different on attitudes toward government in China and in the United States in some ways. So they are much, I guess, more apt to roll out these kind of paternalistic regulations that would not really be probably very readily accepted in the United States. But I just wonder, in terms of the your experience with the pandemic in China. Could you maybe just reflect a little bit on the digital connection there and anything that I mean, I think people would be very interested. None of us probably in the audience have been to China in quite a long time. So it would be really helpful if you could sort of speak to that.
Oh, absolutely. This is one of my favorite topics. My personal favorite topic of discussion is Chinese government data infrastructure. So cut me off whenever I've overstayed my welcome here. But so I do a lot of studying in terms of how each agency of the Chinese government collects data, what data it collects, what data it's responsible for, and then how that data is used to affect outcomes, right? And so when COVID, appeared in China, the very first thing that the government did was turn to technology, right? The Chinese government has spent the last, and many bodies in Chinese government have spent the last 20 years developing a whole series of national or local databases for various purposes, right? And so when COVID emerged, the central government and the CDC kind of went, that's interesting. We already have access to all of these different databases. For example, we have access to the train system database, the plane system database, the telephone network database, right? 5G tower pings. We have access to the health database in the CDC. What if we pool all these things into a pile and we create an app that allows us to do digital contact tracing, right? And, in this, you say something like that in the US and the very idea is anathema. I mean, it just gives people the creeps just thinking about it. But frankly, for the first year in China, everybody I met was very excited to have it, right? That's fine. I would rather turn over, there was this kind of sense of, look, if this is going to help us, not lose our grandparents, if this is going to allow us not to lose a million, have a million dead, if this is going to allow us to be able to walk around outside so long as, we're carrying this track, fine, go ahead and do it. Unfortunately, the anger at that system, started to arise when it got overused, as of course systems like that, it's very hard for governments not to overuse those kind of systems once they're in place. It started, there have been a couple of widely decried incidents where the COVID tracking system has been abused by officials. For example, I believe it was in Henan a couple of months ago, where protesters were descending on a local bank because corruption at the bank had led to freezing of assets and nobody could get their money out. And so these protesters had started going down to the bank to make I think it was Henan, started to make a big deal about it. And local government officials turned all their COVID apps, right? Used their COVID apps as a way to force them to quarantine. It was the first time we'd ever heard about that happening a year into the pandemic. But so you've got, you have incredible digital resources there that for at least the first year did a lot of good, that helped until the Shanghai lockdowns. China's economy continued to function while the rest of the world, struggled heavily. That arguably saved lives. But of course, the existence of technology like that, the access to data like that, particularly with no controls around or loose controls around how the government can use that data, is very dangerous and it's a slippery slope. So
right, that's
interesting
really
times.
interesting. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question on that for
sure.
Kendra or for anyone here? How do you respond to the question that a lot of observers outside of China will say the COVID digital surveillance protocols will long outlive the pandemic, and that this is a total state surveillance system that is now here to stay regardless of public health? How would you respond to that?
Honestly, I think that's wishful thinking, both on the part, on the part of the people that are saying that kind of stuff. But I actually don't, I think that misses the point. It misses the point. It doesn't even matter. What matters is that the databases to create any kind of system similar to that exist. They actually don't need to maintain the COVID tracking system. It doesn't matter, right? The most interesting piece of digital surveillance in China is that over the last 20 years, the foundational databases that drive state surveillance have been built. you take the app is just a manifestation off of the top of that data, right? It's just one way of using the data that exists. You can use that data in 100 other different ways, right? The bigger concern, frankly, is when China is going to end the zero COVID policy at all. So, saying that the app tracking system is going to be around long after COVID, I actually totally disagree with that. My concern is that the zero COVID policy is going to hang out for the next 5 years or something like that, which would be incredibly detrimental. So
oh my goodness.
My clients are also concerned about that.
Why would the zero COVID policy hang around for 5 years without the app, Kendra, or with the app?
Oh, no, I mean that the app will be there as long as zero COVID is there. But my concern is not the app, it's the retention of the policy.
Got it.
All
right. Well, let me just ask one final question before we get to questions from our audience. And a couple of which, Paul, just to give you a heads up, are focused on kind of this document dropped by the Commerce Department that's now in the chat and what implications it may have. But my question is more broad than that, which is, it strikes me that we are approaching, or very likely to be approaching, a global digital divide. One part of the world's consumers will have advanced technology, and they'll kind of be walled off from a significant chunk, at least, of the rest of the world. Even if it's only China, that's 1/5 of humanity, so it's a significant chunk. It also strikes me that this advanced technology may have a pretty high price attached to it, given the way the divide is likely to move, which may put it, out of reach of many people in the world who may be, prepared to have non-leading edge technology at a lower price. So should this be a concern? I mean, how far do you think this tech decoupling in the world will go, and what are the potential ramifications of it? Or is it just clear that the US is going to win because we found a way to sort of kneecap the Chinese and they won't be able to compete?
I'm happy to talk about it first. I think the implications are pretty profound. I mean, making around these controls and the sort of the controls is that the China market is pretty important, right, for U.S. companies. And so to the extent that you're cutting off access to that market, you're essentially undermining the ability of those companies to do research and development, create jobs in the U.S. and do innovation in a way that's national security. Now, that argument has been sort of fallen on deaf ear in the Trump, now in the Biden administration, where the concern has sort of swung back pretty hard around national security and controlling China's military modernization. So, but we don't really, the short answer is we don't really know the full impact of this, because certainly if we do get into this bifurcated world where you do have sort of two technology stacks, at a minimum, that's gonna slow innovation globally, or in part because of for example, the loss of revenue of your companies, very forbearant, arguably, in terms of reacting to some of these controls because of concern over further poisoning the business climate in China. And so this latest, the dropping of this latest document, I think our assessment is that China is probably going to respond to this, almost be forced to respond to this, both sort of publicly and in other ways. For example, internal directives directing Chinese companies to not, to discontinue buying U.S. products and maybe favoring products from Europe or Japan, for example. But we still haven't seen that full shoe drop. And China has some cards in this competition also. We mustn't forget things like rare earths, things like rare earth magnets, things like EV battery inputs and supply chains. So China has the ability to respond, which they haven't done. And there are consequences for China in terms of responding into some of these areas. But I think we still haven't seen the sort of worst case scenario of this bifurcation where China really reacts strongly and brings into play some of these other things that have been talked about for the last couple of years, rolls out the unreliable entities list, looks at, investigates U.S. companies operating in China and really makes it difficult for U.S. businesses in China, and then tries to cut off some of these other supply chain areas where it is dominant, as opposed to those where the U.S. Has the upper hand here. So we're in a difficult world here, and I think today is a watershed to some degree, but we still don't know how far this will go. And then finally, I will say just the impact, for example, on U.S.-China relations, and whether there will be a Biden-Xi face-to-face meeting, for example, in Bali, Indonesia in November. All of that is, I think, up in the air, because the Chinese side appears increasingly concerned about that the U.S. policy is just containing China, particularly in the tech realm, and they see no sort of constructive policy approach on the U.S. side. So the argument is, why should President Xi meet with Biden, without a constructive agenda, basically? And so we could see further downward spiraling of the relationship that will just make it harder, and more likely that we get this bifurcation and the costs of that going forward. And I think that's where we're sort of a crucial point here, where U.S.-China relations really hang in the balance.
Great, thanks very much for that. Sam or Kendra, what are your thoughts on this? Bifurcation. Certainly in the technology space, the hardware space, but also in the data space. And we do have areas, presumably in U.S.-China relations, where especially our scientific communities, collaboration between these two huge behemoths on the global stage is pretty important for things like curing cancer and solving climate change and other things. If we're bifurcated in this way, what are the prospects for those kinds of issues?
Well, Susan, Kendra, you go ahead.
No,
Kendra,
you go ahead.
to you.
Okay.
No, to you.
Kendra.
Okay. So I've always hated the word decoupling. Like, I deeply hate it. And I think that's because, we really haven't wrapped our heads around the full extent of what it actually is, right? Usually when we're talking about decoupling, what we're talking about is supply chains and manufacturing. Will the US and China continue to trade? Will our tech supply chains increasingly disentangle, right? Yes or no? But decoupling is happening along so many different vectors in the tech space. As you said, right? We are connected to each other in R&D issues, right? And it's important that we stay connected to each other in this way. It's also happening along vectors we don't even think about, that nobody is even discussing, right? For example, over the last decade, the emergence of the Great Firewall in China, right, has led to a situation in which the internet ecosystem in China is increasingly very different from the internet ecosystem in the West, right? China now, 10 years down the road, uses different apps, digital payment systems, different types of blockchains. There are different user experience expectations, and there's even different coding methodologies now being used to build digital systems in China, and different database technologies being used, right? The fundamental technologies that underpin the Chinese internet versus the US internet are starting to diverge. We're just starting to diverge, right? And as that goes on and that divergence deepens, and it's going to make cross-border collaboration in the digital economy challenging in a new and unexpected ways, right? We've really already hit a point where US coders are struggling to write code for China. Even the best Chinese coders don't have the training and experience to write code for US facing platforms, right? That divergence where you've got, one internet ecosystem in the world's largest single market and another internet ecosystem elsewhere is going to be incredibly impactful over time, right? So even if all hostilities ceased, right, we would still have this problem. And so that actually creates competitive pressure on China to compete for model adoption. China's in a position where it needs to get foreign businesses, foreign developers, foreign countries using Chinese tools or platforms like Alipay, or the new state-backed digital currency, the DCEP, or Chinese state-backed blockchain networks, not only because it means Chinese companies make more money overseas, or because it advances the Chinese idea of internet governance or cyber sovereignty, but also because China has now hitched the wagon of its digital economy to a juggernaut that is going in a very different direction. which could leave China isolated as time goes on, right? They really want to integrate into the global digital economy. They're building a very different digital economy than we are. So they've got to get, other countries kind of onboarded and integrated into what they're doing. So that's just one example of the many different ways in which decoupling is playing out, right? We have not wrapped our heads around this. And so I caution anybody who is promoting the idea of decoupling without, you are about to, we are undertaking very complex surgery, but we don't know where the vital organs are. And I think that's a dangerous game to be playing.
Oh boy,
Good point.
that's an ugly image. Sam.
I want to just give a really brief, concrete example that I heard recently, because I think this illustrates a lot of these points in a case study. So when Huawei was put on the entity list, one of the unintended consequences was that it also restricted American companies from participating in standards bodies and those working groups alongside Huawei, and I believe some other Chinese firms as well. And I heard recently that one of the ripple effects of this was there was a standard being developed around energy efficiency for data centers. Now, data centers are have a significant drain on the environment. And so this was actually a working group that Chinese engineers, American engineers, and engineers from all over the world were collaborating to create this standard that would make data centers more energy efficient. And so when this came down, all of a sudden, it disrupted the process. Huawei then went and tried to create its own standard for energy efficiency in data centers that kind of sucked. And so what we've done inadvertently is we've made it more difficult to have collaboration on this vital transnational issue. And we keep saying we want China to adapt international standards rather than promote their own alternative for their own market. But then they were forced to come up with their own crappy version in a way where we know that data centers in China are actually a big deal from an environmental perspective. So that's just one in this myriad. And I thought Kendra did a fabulous job of laying out what the scope of that landscape looks like.
Yeah, and let me just quickly add in here, Susan. I agree with everything Sam and Kendra have said here. I think for me, and I've been saying this for some time, the bottom line to me is, and I heard this from has gone into gauging the impact of these new measures and all these other sorts of policies that are contributing to this decoupling or these supply chains, and China's likely to retaliate. And I think that the challenge here, as Kendra says, we're doing this sort of complex surgery, but we don't really know what the landing point is. Don't really the costs are going to be, but we know they're going to be considerable. Controls that have been dropped today. NVIDIA in their SEC filing said that's going to they're going to take a hit of $400 million on a quarterly basis, and I think it's probably higher than that. And so when you sort of all of the effects of these measures together, we're talking about the U.S. economy and an equal more. And so I think that the challenge is sort of understanding, where does as you start tearing apart these very closely knit supply chains, for example, the efficiency that built up and all the other beneficial here, and at a point where we know the full cost, but they're going to be considerable. And I think that's a challenge. And then finally, I'll just note that, as Kendra really points out, I mean, the real battleground here, in some sense, is the countries outside of the U.S. and China. The Belt and Road countries, in the case of China, or Digital Silk Road. Are they going to choose sides? None of these countries really want to choose sides in this competition, but they're going to be forced to, in part because of the technology domain, where we're going to have different standards potentially, or different supply chains, and so they're going to almost be forced to choose sides because of that. And that's really an important issue, because it's going to be really messy, right? I mean, Africa and Latin America, parts of those continents might side with China because of historical ties, and want to be less dependent on U.S. technology. And then, of course, the developed world, Europe, North America, will sort of continue to be part of that advanced technology ecosystem. So we're in for a different world over the next 5 years.
I mean, thank you very much for that, Paul. And I'll just point out that one of the other factors for the rest of the world is going to be price. And so that's been relevant in the adaptation of Huawei hardware in a lot of these countries where China's been willing to, sort of roll out programs and loans along its digital Silk Road and gotten Huawei kit installed. And I mean, it was a very attractive prospect in a lot of these places. And so, I mean, the question of whether we'll be able to compete, I guess will depend a little bit on sort of how all of this unfolds and how countries will come down. Will depend to some extent on that. We have a bunch of questions and we're out of time, but I just want to run through a couple of them if you don't mind. We've had some technical glitches that have set us back a little bit, and so I just want to note a couple of these questions from our terrific audience, and thanks for sticking with us through the glitches, which I'm not sure I can explain, but maybe we can. So we have a question about the election of the U.S. candidate Doreen Bogdan Martin as the Secretary General at the ITU and how that will impact the U.S. ability to push forward on standards in this area. I think Sam talked a bit about this, and that was a great case study. I think it's probably still a work in progress as to how this is going to unfold in standards bodies, but the US government's definitely giving a lot more attention to it. So I'll just throw that one out there in case anyone wants to comment. We'll have a last round of comments before we close here. We also have a question about this Chip 4 initiative with Japan, the ROK, Taiwan, and the US. How we think that's going to go, what are the implications of it. Of course, questions about the implications, like I said, and Paul, you already addressed it to some extent, the possible retaliation for the measures that are being dropped today, which expand, we should just note, probably much beyond companies that can reasonably be closely associated with China's military modernization and move, as Kendra and Paul have both alluded, into much more sort of broader range of companies that wouldn't necessarily have that as a outstanding characteristic. And then, questions about U.S. government involvement in kind of picking sectors to promote, and how does this square with a lot of past U.S. Economic ideals with respect to industrial policy. Paul, you sort of alluded to this. And let's see. There's a few other questions about, sort of free trade issues. Let's see. How do we deal with sanctioned entities not having due process? Because Sam and I are both at Yale Law School, our friend Steve Orlins felt it was appropriate to raise the legal issues. And there are also, a more general question here about how do we justify, so maybe this is sort of connected to this issue of due process and legal issues. How is the US justifying, in terms of the international rules-based order, these kinds of anti-competitive moves? Anyway, all of those, and there are probably some that I've missed, but let's just go through a lightning round of last thoughts. Anything you want to leave our audience with in the next couple of minutes? Kendra, I'll go to you first, and Sam, and then Paul, you can close us out. So Kendra, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as we move forward, it just behooves us not to sleepwalk into war, right? Somebody said to me very recently that we're always fighting the last war, right? But I think in this case, what is critically important is for both the US and China to, not just pile on with, frankly, anti-US or anti-China peer pressure, but to soberly look at where we want the US-China relationship to be 10 years from now and make a real attempt to work backwards from there. And so, I hope some of the people on this call will be in a position to help us advance along more rational lines.
Sam.
On a slightly positive note, when I look at the policy tools that have been put in place from Beijing and Washington under this umbrella of so-called decoupling, none of these tools have yet been taken to their full effect. None of them have been implemented in the most far-reaching, blunt instrument way possible. And I think it's not just because, as someone say, oh, the business community is lobbying. No, I think that there is a recognition on both sides by policymakers of the consequences if you take these to their full effect. Now, that doesn't mean we need to become that we can just sit back and relax about this, because we don't know who's the next administration that's coming in, what political dynamics, because when that infrastructure is in place, it is dangerous. But for now, I think that there is a last gasp of pragmatism and understanding of the consequences when I look at the array of tools that have not yet been fully fired.
Okay, that's our hopeful, optimistic take. Paul.
I guess I'm less optimistic. I just would echo what Kendra said, which is, I would like to see some sign that on both sides, in Beijing and Washington, there's some sense of where people see the relationship ending, going over the next 10 years, because neither country is going away, that the politics are still going to be contentious. But I think we are in this moment now where we do seem to be drifting towards conflict here, as Kendra noted here, and without any sense of getting back to some level of constructive engagement on things like climate change and other issues. And so the danger, I think, is that neither side can articulate a vision for how the two biggest economies and most important countries globally can get along here in over the next 5 to 10 years. And so the lack of that means that this downward spiral the guardrails are sort of off, and every action like we see today sort of reduces those guardrails, because both sides increasingly see this as a zero-sum game. And I think that's the real danger, that we need to get out of that dynamic. And it's tough because the domestic politics in both countries now are really having a big impact. It's great to be tough on China in the U.S. and in China, the argument is the U.S. is containing us, and we're not going to make any changes. So I look back fondly to that brief period in May of 2019 when the trade talks, which were a very serious effort by the two sides to resolve these serious differences, were sort of at their height, and it looked like we might get an agreement. And then since then, everything has been downhill. And I think that was an example of where the two sides really came together and, with very, very detailed discussions. And it's so hard to see that kind of an engagement in this current climate here. And I think that's the danger, is that we can't envision that. The fact that we can't envision that at all right now is worrisome. And I think I don't see any light right now in the short term at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, and let me just remind, it was January 2020 when those trade talks actually culminated in an agreement that was roundly celebrated by the then Trump administration. And then 3 days later, as Kendra will remember well, the Chinese locked down Wuhan, and everything's been spiraling downward since there. We still really haven't found a floor. And I mean, it's quite alarming that, there's so much, even in this conversation among people who have been in China and worked on China, so much mention of the word conflict, military conflict, and also, I mean, it's interesting to note that in a conversation about US-China technology, we haven't heard this term small yard, high fence, which means that probably the yard is no longer small. And
the yard is pretty big.
It's moving in that direction. So let's hope that our audience and all of our peers out there who have a chance to hear this conversation and think about these issues will consider that fairly ominous trend and hopefully do something before it gets too ominous. But I really thank all of you for weighing in with all your excellent comments and observations. I commend to people, we've put in the chat a couple of things that are worth looking at, and certainly we'll all be paying attention to the news coming out of Washington today and watching for how that lands. Thank you all so much for doing this, even amid the technical glitches, and all the best, and stay in touch.